We're really excited. Welcome. We're so excited today to have you all here today for the guest speaker series. The speaker series is part of From Farms to Incubators new menteeship program, a collaboration between us and academic researchers at the University of California, Merced School of Engineering. Really excited to share that this week our guest speaker is Sarah Nolet, who will present on investing in ag tech, how I did it. First, a little about Sarah. Sarah is an entrepreneur, she's an investor, and she's a podcaster as well. She believes in combining the power of technology and commercial incentives to build a more sustainable and resilient agri-food system. She is the co-founder and managing partner of Tenacious Ventures, Australia's first agtech venture firm. A little bit about Tenacious Ventures. It has over 50 million in assets under management, with investors including primary producers and agribusiness executives. And so far, it's backed 14 startups building a more sustainable and resilient agri-food system. She's also known for sharing, Sarah's also known for sharing her candid insights about agriculture innovation. She's the host of a podcast called agtech So What, which regularly gets about, 15,000 monthly downloads and has released over 150 episodes featuring global sustainability executives, leading primary producers, venture investors, academics, and entrepreneurs. She has engineering degrees from MIT and Tufts University, and she was a three-sport varsity athlete, soccer, basketball, and track and field. And she's recognized as an All-American for soccer, and she received the Rudolph J. Bobert Award for Extraordinary Multi-Sport Student Athlete. So I'm really excited to have Sarah here today.
Thank you for having me. Really nice to hopefully meet some of you today and make this a little bit interactive. It's always embarrassing to have your bio read out like that, but maybe for any podcast listeners or aspiring podcast hosts, that's a takeaway. Yeah, just wanted to talk a little bit about my journey and background, and then open it up to questions. So, I grew up in California, actually, so not too far from many of you, I imagine, in the Bay Area. And though I was sort of in the thick of the Silicon Valley world and technology and entrepreneurship, my focus was mostly on playing sports, and that's what I wanted to do for the first kind of 20 years of my life. I got lucky, though, because when I went to college, the gym was next door to the computer science department. And that is truly why I studied computer science for many reasons. I ended up loving it. And starting my career in systems engineering in a product role, building intelligence systems for the Department of Defense for of all things. But really that path for me was one of I think my parents had really told me, you can do something career-wise, make money, and then do something good for the world. And that was, they were sort of separate, right? You go make money, and then maybe you can give it back or do something you care about. And so I listened at first, and yet got kind of into that career, loved the complexity, loved the scale of what we were doing, loved the technology, but ultimately didn't feel any kind of passion for the applications or the users of what we were doing. And because I had played three sports, I didn't study abroad. And so I had that kind of question of wanting to live overseas or thinking about traveling internationally. And so decided to quit my job, and I went to South America for what ended up being almost a year. And over that time, I largely lived on farms. And that is what got me interested in agriculture. And I mean, fundamentally changed my life. I remember harvesting tomatoes by hand on a small organic vegetable farm next to a giant winery, and was just like, this is so crazy. These people are living effectively below the poverty line, but they're super happy. That seems like unfathomable from where I grew up in California, and yet they're using very little technology, but super innovative in a bunch of things they're doing, looking at kind of direct to consumer models and launching new business lines and thinking about value adding, but all of that is in their heads. There's no accounting or software. And so it was just this really interesting journey for me to say and climate change is impacting what they do. and they are impacting the climate in terms of emissions and production. And so for me, it was this realization of agriculture was this fascinating industry that actually aligned a lot of my passions and was a big global multi-trillion-dollar system where someone with a technology background and the kind of business insights that I had growing up in Silicon Valley would really apply. And so that kicked off what's been now more than a decade in food and ag. I didn't think I'd be an investor though. So that's kind of step one was how did I get to food and ag? And then step two was how did I end up as an investor? When I came back from South America, I was committed to working in kind of food systems and climate, but I had no idea what that looks like. And so first went to my dad's hobby farm and said, like, let me spend a summer here and think about like, should I be a farmer? Do I really need that like mud on my boots? Is that the role for me? And realized that it was not the role for me. Like I was gonna put a lot of farmers almost insult them by how bad I was going to be at this, and had other skills that I could bring to this space. And so have huge respect and would never be in a position to tell a farmer what to do by any means. Because it is such a challenging role. And so realized that, okay, what was the next thing I was going to look at? I was fortunate enough to be accepted to MIT to do a master's in systems and applied all of that to food systems. And so thought, well, maybe like developing world, that's kind of roughly the context I had been living in South America. So did research on transition to organic farming in an Indian agricultural context, went to India, interviewed a bunch of farmers via like two translators to get to the right language and back. Fascinating work, but ultimately for me, like the pace of that kind of NGO type work that a lot of developing country work is being done just wasn't going to, again, align with my skill sets and passion. So then I said, okay, well, what about the corporate world? Like, what about turning a big ship, like a small degrees? And so did some corporate sustainability work out in Iowa for a food manufacturer, really kind of building their, like, this was before really like SBTI commitments or any of these corporate sustainability commitments were super mainstream. And so I was looking at the early players in that space and saying, okay, what could this company embrace? What would the business cases be for that? And for me, it was like the sustainability departments are under-resourced. The business cases are not always that strong. And again, it's just not going to move that fast. So that wasn't the right place for me either. And so then started thinking, well, I grew up in this technology world. I've got this technology background. What are the entrepreneurs doing and who's funding them? And so started looking at that as like a real opportunity to drive scale change, because I had sort of looked at small scale. I had looked at both small scale farmers and smaller scale kind of companies, looked at really big companies and said, well, the middle path for me here is technology that could drive whole of system change. But who's going to fund it? And so I wrote my master's thesis on investing in the food system. And that was really an excuse for me at the time with my .edu address, where you're sort of not threatening, you're not a competitor or anything, to call and interview 70 plus investors in the space. And that was kind of everyone at the time. In like 2013, 14, Monsanto had just acquired the Climate Corporation. Agtech was now kind of part of the venture capital lingo. And so I went and talked to everyone, and it was really fascinating to see to what degree impact was or wasn't a focus, how much people were innovating on the venture capital model or not, given its agriculture and natural systems. And so I kind of planted that seed in the back of my head that, there's some change to be done there and some innovation to be done there, but I don't have a finance degree. Like, what am I going to do in that space? And then we moved to Australia. So my husband got a job in Australia. We said, oh, wait, we'll live overseas for another year, and that could be really fun. And I showed up here really not knowing anyone in the whole country, and saying the number one thing for me is I will continue to work in food systems and climate. And I really care about who I work with. Like for me, that's my North Star. Could be big company, could be small company, could be tech, could be finance. That part is sort of less important to me. But who I work with is my number one thing after this area I'm interested in. And I never really found anyone to work for, but I did find a lot of people who wanted me to do projects for them. And so I ended up starting a consulting business. I was already consulting back to my thesis advisor at MIT and had a few projects on the go and said, okay, well, let's sort of turn this into a business. And so that became what was called Agtech. And we did a lot of work with international companies in agribusiness, research organizations, startups, accelerator programs. We built accelerator programs. We ran accelerator programs, and really helped to build the ecosystem here in Australia to commercialize and fund and adopt technology in food and agriculture. And it was super exciting because Australia is this really unique place. I'm not sure how much you guys know about it, but like secondly subsidized agricultural economy in the world. And so versus the US, quite a different context because there really isn't this subsidy program like you'd have in the Farm Bill in the US. Larger scale properties in a lot of cases, yet poor soils, super volatile climate. And the farmers are therefore really commercial. Like they're facing these big climate threats. They don't have the same support system you'd have in the US from a subsidy perspective. And so what's made them successful and able to export all this food and fiber is a combination of the research and how kind of commercial and innovative they are. And so that's a great kind of baseline for technology development because if the farmers are adopting it, it has to make sense. It has to make economic sense. And so that always seemed like a big opportunity and kind of under leveraged in terms of people weren't commercializing that research. And so a couple of years into that journey, the business was going well. We were excited to stay in Australia, and I met my now co-founder and business partner, Matthew, who's a 57-year-old Australian man. So we're not sort of typical co-founders in that sense, different genders, different decades, different countries, et cetera. But he was the first person where I said, look, I really could see myself working with you. And so he said, fortunately, the same thing. And he ended up joining the consulting business as a partner. We worked together for a year and then said, really the ecosystem's mature enough now that the programs we're running, we don't need to be the ones that are running these or kind of involved operationally. Like, let's sell that part of the business. Let's keep the kind of core part where we do insights and work with farmers and get those inside scoop on ag. And let's launch the capital side of the business because we're now seeing companies that we're working with as clients who are, we think, globally interesting. Like they're startups that are punching above their weight of anything we're seeing in Silicon Valley or Israel. And yet the investors are calling us saying, well, you've got a podcast, you've got deal flow, ag tech. We don't know how to invest in this stuff. It's hardware, it's biology, it's early stage. And so we said it's time to raise a fund. And so that was 2019. We sort of hatched this plan to raise a fund, which we had no idea how to do. And then figured that out for quite a while. And then in early 2020, March 2020, actually, which is an interesting time globally, as you guys know, we did first close of Fund One. So that was $20 million. We started investing and then did final close of that fund in 2021. So that was 35 million, and we got on with investing. And so since then, we've been called Tenacious Ventures. The agtech brand's kind of been folded into Tenacious. And we call ourselves a venture firm, not a venture capital firm. But our whole mission is to think about systems change around climate in agri-food. And we do that through our insights, which includes our podcast and our newsletter, but also work with corporates and industry bodies, kind of understanding how the system is changing, accelerating adoption. And then on the capital side, investing. So we've had to learn and grow how to be ag tech investors. Our first two funds are venture capital funds. So early equity, kind of couple hundred K up to $1 million checks into these companies. Sometimes we sit on the board. Sometimes we follow on and have, a couple $1 million invested into these companies. And they're all along the value chain. So they're food waste management, on-farm autonomy, pest management, green ammonia. And we think it's really important to do a lot of deep tech or hard tech, so non-software, because ultimately the food system and agriculture is a lot more about atoms and molecules than it is about bits and bytes. And so unlike a lot of VC investors, we think of ourselves as venture investors, a broader toolkit for kind of where we look to invest. So I'll stop there and maybe take any questions or double click on any of that. But yeah, I was a pretty reluctant investor in many cases, but it was really through this process of overarching passion and vision for climate and agriculture and technology as a leverage point. And then the people I would work with, and then finding places where I could uniquely solve problems. And even though I didn't know anything about finance, I felt like this was a real gap in the system. And so back myself and our team to learn about it and get the right people around us to become investors. And so that is what we have done.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for sharing your a bit of your journey. That I actually don't know too much personally about Australia, so that's very interesting to learn about some of the unique aspects of what's going on in agriculture there. Yeah, I just there's so much rich material, rich information you just shared, but I kind of want to jump into a bit about the investment aspect. How do you I imagine there's just so many different startups out there and they're knocking on your door and they're emailing or they're connecting with you. How do you specifically identify what is your rubric in saying
Yeah.
"Hey, this is like a company we want to invest in. We see promise in them." Can you share a little bit more about what the process is? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So they do come in all shapes and sizes and from all places. We try to reduce bias in our process and not have it be like, oh, warm intro, so and so, no, so and so. And so we want everyone to kind of come through the same front door if possible, which is kind of filling out the form on our website. That doesn't always work perfectly, but we have invested in everything from someone who we knew for a long time or came through a warm intro and literally filled out the form on our website and we had never met them and we got to conviction and invested. So we're really, really proud of that and try to reduce bias because, from our perspective, just because you don't speak fluent venture capital jargon, like doesn't mean you're not building a good business. And so we really try to be conscious of that. But when we assess companies, for us, it starts with kind of six pathways that we have that we think about how food and agriculture is changing. An example of those is like sustainable protein. We don't necessarily care if it's plants or animals or grown in a lab or grown outdoor. Like we believe overall fundamentally demand for protein is growing and we need to produce it in ways that are is profitable for the value chain and sustainable from an environmental perspective. And so within that there's a bunch of areas we might look, and so that's kind of the first thing is, does it fit one of our pathways or areas we're interested in, and do we think it roughly screens for impact, because we do think of ourselves as impact investors. And so at that very first step, we're roughly kind of saying, do we think there's a commercial opportunity here? Does it align with one of our pathways for how the system's changing? And two, is it impact? And we think of that specifically as three things: ecological sustainability, decarbonization, or adaptation and resilience. So those are our lenses for impact. So if it passes that first kind of screen, we also look at sort of stage and how much money they're raising and some of those metrics, because if they're looking for $100 million and they're profitable and all the, like, we're just not the right fit. We write really small checks, we come in really early, and so there's just a bit of the puzzle pieces roughly fit. And the last piece of that kind of puzzle equation is strategic to Australia. So we are based here. We were the first agri-food venture firm here. We have hopefully quite a strong, credible reputation here. We know a lot of the players here. And so there needs to be some link to Australia. That doesn't mean they're headquartered here. It doesn't mean they're even fully operating here, but it's sort of like, why are we a good partner for you?
Right.
So if it passes that full screen, then we look at kind of three things in our investment process after that over probably a number of weeks as we get to know the company and do our diligence. Roughly, it's opportunity, company, and then partnership. So opportunities, the things you kind of expect: market size, competitors, customers, all of that kind of stuff, like what's happening in the market. Company is all the dynamics of the company itself. So the team, we're really big on team. These companies are early, and so often it's more about the founders than any kind of technology, because it might not even be built yet. So the team, the strategy, the technology, if it exists, the business model, all that kind of stuff. And then we say partnership because I think a lot of investors call them deals, which feels like you're already screwing over these companies that you're working with because you're getting a deal. We like to call them partnerships because we truly think that's what we're doing here. And so in that category would be things like who's on the cap table, do the terms make sense, all of the kind of mechanics of putting together that partnership. And so our process is really iterating through week by week to gain or lose conviction across those three categories, is really how we qualify.
What are some of the areas within agri-food tech that you're seeing, in terms of the types of companies or categories under?
So one we're excited about that would be no surprise to you guys, given kind of where you are, would be in that autonomy and automation space. And so that's one we've made at least two. You could maybe categorize three of our current investments roughly in that space. But when we look at it, it really fits in that lower intensity production category or thematic for us, whether that's lower input intensity, lower resource intensity. There's a lot there that I think growers are under pressure and have real constraints they're facing. Labor, obviously a massive one, as you guys well know. And so equipment and autonomy can be this sort of opportunity. And what's really interesting, the way we think about it, is it's not just taking away humans and putting in machines. Like that is a really narrow view, I think, of what autonomy can do in agriculture. We think of it as like all the things equipment does and all the things humans do combined is this much bigger market that, and when you have autonomy in that space, you actually could do new, completely different things. And that creates new opportunities for farmers and for humans. And so, to give you an example, we've invested in a company called Swarm Farm Robotics. They're an autonomous agricultural kind of platform company. And so, they make like decently large scale, almost a ton robots, fully autonomous. And they have, if you think of kind of a app store like you'd have with your iPhone, they have the iPhone part, which is their robot, the equipment, and then the app store is different apps and attachments that can connect to the robot. So that might be a mower, a sprayer, a spreader, a thinner, all those kinds of things. One of the big use cases they do is that precision weed management. And so what's interesting about that use case is they save labor. Of course, the robot can go out and run 24/7. They've sold over 100. So there's hundreds of these out in Australia commercially operating for years now. This isn't like an idea. It's not in a lab. This like really exists. They're just expanding into the US. So saves labor, runs 24/7, and reduces soil compaction because it's much lighter weight and saves on input usage up to 98% because you're just spraying the weeds instead of the plant. And that's really exciting because there's a bunch of positive environmental and economic benefits there. But what I was kind of saying before, there's some interesting, I guess, second order effects where you might say, oh, it's replacing humans. Of course, often they can't get humans to do those jobs. But also, if you think of some of these areas, especially in Australia, these kind of regional towns, a lot of people are leaving and don't want to come back to farm. But the people that do come back are going to go to the farm with a robot. And we're already seeing it almost as like a labor attractor because these are more modern farms. These are investing in safety, in operations, in higher value tasks that humans can do that make more money, et cetera. And so we're actually seeing this kind of interesting side effect as more of a labor attractor. And then we also see it opening up new agronomy when you can do passes at any time of day, when you can precision apply, you actually could look at new types of input products or new types of agronomy that you would use because you're operating at a different time in this season. So I spent a lot of time on that just to say, we think autonomy is this big area, and that's one example of a company, but I like it because it shows how it's not just like, do this job that this human does with a machine. It actually opens up probably new ways of farming and new opportunities that don't exist currently. So that's an area we're really excited about.
Yeah, I love that example and that specific, story about that. And it does seem like it hits a lot of different aspects, of
Yeah.
agriculture and sort of a win-win. I'm gonna open up the floor to other questions. It's not that I have many questions, but let's open it up here.
Hi, I'm Tom Harmon. I'm a professor of environmental engineering at UC Merced and director of the Sierra Nevada Research Institute.
Awesome.
Um,
Hi, Tom.
Hi. Interesting to think about labor, and I wonder if just maybe it'd probably be a little bit of a broad brush comparison, but what the current situation with farm labor is in Australia versus California, where we've sort of gotten behind on ag tech because we've had the luxury of cheap labor, but now
Mm.
we're that luxury is running out rapidly. How is it compared to the way things have evolved in Australia?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a really good question. And I think probably you're right in that it's an area where because of the conditions here, whether that's like regulatory, size of farms, environment, et cetera, access to labor, like Australia's an island country in some ways. And so we don't have like a border, with others like the US. Yeah, they have had to solve those challenges differently. So the kind of scale of the farms, the style of operations would reflect a lot of adoption of things that make equipment more automated, more suitable. So to give you an example, like controlled traffic in terms of like a broadacre, like row crop context, super widely adopted, which enables into like no-till and cover cropping and some of those practices that the US is just starting to say like, does this make sense? Have been pretty widely adopted here for a while. on the horticulture side, in like the specialty context, there is still a lot of demand for manual labor. We haven't invented any harvesters that are that you guys haven't seen. If we did, we'd be commercializing them in the US, I'm sure. There is a lot of both backpackers that come, and there's sort of specific government programs for backpackers. Even if you're going to get on a path to a visa here in Australia, you have to do a year. It's a year, maybe 6 months of like farm work. And so the government actually sort of incentivizes and thinks about that rural aspect of Australia. And then there is sort of Pacific Island labor that often comes over. The big shock here, as would have been somewhat true in the US, was COVID. And so because the Australian borders were like completely closed, that Pacific Island labor in particular was just entirely inaccessible. And so that was a big shock to the system. And I think really the news in the last couple weeks is just starting to say, like, it looks like it's kind of recovered. The volume of backpackers we have for the grain harvest this year, and some of the specialty like horticulture labor, like we're just seeing that come back. So I think it'll be interesting to see what changes people had to make in that interim period that are now going to stick. And we'll only know that kind of in the coming years, because, you get a shock to the system and that's what you learn. But yeah, by no means do we have a kind of H2A similarity, and like the investments that we see in places like Washington and California, like millions of dollars into infrastructure for humans to come do these jobs. It's kind of not necessarily the same here.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right. I know that there are other questions.
Yeah, I can go next. Hi, Sarah. I'm Savio. I'm a mentee from Farms to Incubators. I'm a current computer science and engineering student at UC Merced.
Awesome. Hi,
And my
Savio.
question, yeah, my question to you is, what trends in ag tech do you believe are going to shape the future of agriculture over the next decade? Whether it's sustainable, whether it's like innovation, seeds. I know we spoke to the CEO of Inari earlier. So what kind of trends within ag tech do you think can we see in the next like decade or so, or maybe even farther into the future that you can see maybe developing right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I guess my first thought when you were saying that was on the ag side, because I think ag tech needs to solve problems for agriculture. And so what's happening in agriculture is where I kind of start with that. And I think the adaptation and resilience question, like climate adaptation and resilience, is going to be really massive. And that requires tools from seeds to other inputs to equipment to supply chain innovations, business model innovations, risk, insurance, et cetera. Because if you think about some of the significant effects we've seen, fires, floods, droughts, like the extreme nature of those events is just going to get more common. And so whether that's going to lead to shifting production regions, like we can't grow this here, we have to grow it there, or we don't have water here, or the economics don't make sense, we're ripping out these trees, we're seeing that kind of thing, all the way to we're getting frosts in grapes in places that we didn't have frost before. And so we need frost protection that we never had in this industry, or there's fires. And so there's smoke taint, like all of these kind of both biotic and abiotic stresses, I think are really accelerating. And it's not evenly distributed right now. Some places are facing it more than others. And so there hasn't been like a big incentive for the existing companies to develop like one solution that rolls out everywhere. But I think that's where ag tech is going to come in and say, like, we're seeing this kind of inkling of these challenges growing, whether that's frost in wine grapes, and that's going to be a bigger problem. And so let's start developing a solution for that. And I think it's quite exciting because it's both like physical solutions, like a new biological input or a new seed treatment or new equipment to apply things at a different time, but also kind of software and financial innovations like insurance. So we're seeing companies use artificial intelligence to help growers like better select and navigate the range of insurance products that exist in the US right now, to get like better coverage faster for the unique situations they're facing. Or in Australia, we're seeing similar technology applied to look at like parametric products, because we don't have that existing insurance system, but they could develop something that says, okay, if it hails, you get this insurance, like that kind of flip the switch type of parametric product. And so artificial intelligence is looking at that. So that's kind of where we start. And I think it's useful to say, what's the problem or the dynamic in the industry? and then what are the suite of solutions, and then what's the technology. Even though I, like you know, have a computer science degree, it's fun to start with the technology, like what's the thing we can build. Starting the other way, there's like no end of opportunities for computer science and software to play a role in these solutions.
Got it. Thank you.
Hi, Sarah. My name is Laurel. I'm one of the other mentees for From Farms to Incubators on the project.
Hi, Laurel.
My question for you is we've heard some of the or I feel like I've heard some comparisons that you've made between like the American and Australian side of the ecosystems of agtech. So I was wondering if you have found any other differences between the ecosystems within their work, being in both places.
In terms of like how you get jobs and like the kind of culture of like career paths, is that what you mean?
Right. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So these are funny ones because like being an American and coming to another country, you get reflected back like a lot of what is American, and some good and some bad, as you can imagine. So first of all, America basically never like asks, oh, how do we compare to this other country, right? Like only in a call like this where you're sort of forced to think about it. Whereas you get to Australia and the first question always is like, okay, are we ahead or behind America in this? And then you go to New Zealand and New Zealand's like, are we ahead or behind Australia in this? And that always struck me as really funny because in some ways, it's a really like useful question to ask. Like, how do we compare? What can we learn? Like, it's this sort of growth mindset. And also Americans are like, well, we're obviously ahead because we're America. And so I think that kind of dynamic is, and in some ways it's true, right? So that's kind of one that I always laugh at because it's a question that I like wasn't prepared to answer because I had never really heard it being asked in America. And then it gets asked, so much elsewhere. I think there's a lot more familiarity with entrepreneurship in America, the sort of culturally, this idea of like starting a company and being self-made and, taking it all the way to scale and raising money. And that's obviously it's still a quite privileged path. And, it's not by any means equitable or accessible for all, but it's much more common and familiar and sort of touted in the US. Whereas in Australia, I think it's the more common path is like get a job at a big corporate and buy a house, and then you really made it. And so it's like a little bit culturally different when we talk about startups and entrepreneurship and innovation. The contrast there, I would say, though, is like farmers in Australia, because of those conditions I mentioned, like it's super hard to farm here. They're super entrepreneurial and they're really self-made and really like savvy business people. So I always find that contrast sort of between the US and Australia and across different areas of Australia really interesting. To maybe give you an example, my husband works in like tech, like a big software company here. And he would always say like the culture in Australia, like it's sort of start at 9, leave at 4, everyone has a beer. It's really like work hard, play hard, but like pretty casual. Like it's not this like grind culture of the US. Whereas because I work with startups and farmers, I'm like, the Australians are the hardest working people I know. Like, but it's just sort of different pockets of society, if that makes sense. And so I always think that's, he's like, how can I hire an Australian that don't work hard? And I'm like, well, I know plenty of Australians that work hard. So I always think that kind of contrast is interesting. But overall, like much more similar than different. Like, yes, it's another country. Yes, there are cultural differences, but overall, like Western, like English speaking, agriculture roughly functions similarly, production functions similarly, like much more similar than different.
That's great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. Sarah, I'm curious about where you see women investors in ag tech. So this is a story that I've been following for a while, and there's been this broader take that there are not enough women investors or venture capitalists in this space. It's been a challenge for women-led startups. So what are you observing out there, and where is the pendulum kind of going?
Yeah. This is a really tricky problem. And obviously gender is one lens, race, like there's a ton of other lenses where like the data on who gets funded is really skewed to a certain group of people. And by no means do I think they're the only group of people that have great ideas or can build great companies. So definitely more work to be done there. We are really proud that in our portfolio, we have like just over 50% actually of our companies like have female founders or co-founders, and we have 3 single female founder CEOs, which is quite rare. Like I think only 2% of companies in venture have single female founder CEOs. So I don't know, like, is that because I'm out in the front talking and I'm female? Like our COO identifies as female? Like I'm not sure like what the kind of correlation causation is, but for sure it plays a role. Like we have designed Tenacious to be a certain way, and we've intentionally done things like you come through the same front door. We think about, bias in our processes. We do behavioral interviews. We look for different kinds of backgrounds and attributes. And so if I was someone else designing that, would it be designed differently? Maybe. So I think there is some kind of intentionality there. In ag tech, though, I actually see probably more female founders than in other sectors. And I have a couple of hypotheses why that's true, but I actually don't, there's no real data, like it's not a big enough space yet. In agriculture, women play a really big role in like decision making on farm around like financial decisions. Often you have this dynamic, especially in Australia, where maybe the female got like brought back to the farm. She has a degree elsewhere in finance or something, and they married a farmer and comes back to the farm. That's sort of the farmer found a wife kind of cliche story. And so brings all these other skills off farm and then is making a lot of decisions around technology and innovation, which then kind of leads to, more potential for commercialization. I think there's also a lot of researchers in the ag tech world because these aren't software companies. And so you have more women in the sciences, not so much like in engineering. And so there's kind of like a different pool for founders. I'm not sure. Maybe it's newer, maybe it's climate, maybe the impact piece. Those are hypotheses and sort of anecdotes that we see. But ultimately, we're proud of the portfolio we have. We don't know how that will scale and change. It's not something we specifically select for, but it's something we're passionate and proud of and conscious of. And we need to see more improvement. The last thing I would say on that is it's quite different, the like emphasis in Australia versus the US on this kind of thing. In Australia, because there isn't as much venture capital, it's probably earlier, just in terms of maturity. The real focus is still on gender. And so that's like, we don't have enough female investors. We don't have enough females getting funded. Whereas if you look in the US, I think there's a lot more focus on like other areas of diversity and inequality, whether that's, race or sexual orientation or socioeconomics. And so it's just a lot more mature in the kind of thinking around those like lenses of inequality and of diversity. Whereas in Australia, like we're just starting to talk about gender. So it's kind of interesting to compare as well, like the sort of journeys that the ecosystems are on in terms of thinking about this.
That's interesting. So on the heels of that, what do you think is needed? I mean, what I'm hearing is that Australia is still in an early stage in many different ways. So what role are you playing in that? I thought I had also learned that you have a meetup. Is that correct? Is that for
Yeah, we do. Yeah. So we started the Sydney AgTech meetup. I don't know, we got 1,200 or something people in that group, and we roughly run 4 to 6 events a year and get sort of 30 to 100 people along at each one. And so that's a great community. And that, I mean, like that's a really easy and obvious example where you can be the change that you want to see in the world. Like, let's make sure the panel is diverse. Like, let's make sure and in age, in gender, in race, in like all that kind of stuff. Like we get to control who we invite and who we have speak. So we can, for sure, I believe it's about getting the best speaker. And if the best speakers seem obviously to be, white and male and 50, okay, work harder to find others. And often you can, right? Like that's almost always true. So yeah, that's like a platform that we can use to do that. And in terms of what's needed more broadly, there's a bunch of initiatives happening now around, I think, just raising awareness of these kinds of challenges and then tracking data. Like, what does the top of the funnel incoming data look like? Because you could say, well, it's sort of 50-50 male and female, and then we're just only backing the male founded startups, or is it the pipeline itself has more of one than the other? And in Australia, at least, there hasn't been good data on that. And so it's hard to know, like, do you need a intervention at sort of the bottom of the funnel or an intervention at the top of the funnel? And so there's a lot of initiatives right now working to kind of get better data to be able to better make, decisions about that kind of thing.
Excellent. I know that there are probably more questions out there.
I have more questions, Amy. I don't want to hog the floor though, but this is just really interesting.
Go ahead, Tom.
Thanks. So as part of one of our projects, we've been looking at labor and automation in California agriculture, and this has led us to look at comparatively at other countries. Um, and we take we've looked at Japan, for example, which is even more severe labor issues with I think the average age of a Japanese farmer now is like in the late 60s or something like that. People are just leaving in droves for the cities. And but we've kind of found that on the bottom up side of the gender issue, automation in Japan is leading to more opportunities for women because it can take some of the strain and the danger out of some of the work. And Komatsu, which is a big construction company, has sort of pioneered some automation and had some really fantastic programs like single moms operating heavy equipment from their living rooms, right? Because they just have to get it close enough to the edge of the field, and then it takes it from there, you know, with its localization capabilities. So I'm wondering if maybe it's probably early in the game, but will mechanization and automation sort of refresh the pool from the bottom up on a more even basis?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you know a lot more about that than I do. So I run the risk of like not adding any value. The example that came to mind here that's sort of similar is if you look like we raise a lot of sheep for wool and meat, which obviously is different than the US, but is a big part of Australia and New Zealand agriculture. And shearing sheep is like physically an extremely physically demanding task. And so there's been a bunch of initiatives to like build a robot that will shear a sheep. I mean, of all the tasks in agriculture, like that is probably got to be the hardest thing you could possibly get a robot to do. Like picking apples is easy comparatively, and like apples are hard to pick with a robot. The sheep move and like all that kind of, they're different in sizes, and so that seems like a big waste of money. The next kind of level of innovation is sort of a human augmented, like a sort of human suit that you'd wear because it's really quite taxing physical work and you're bending over and it's dangerous and it's hot. And so could you like augment the human to do it? And maybe that equalizing, I think still decently hard. Most recently, they came out with some early research on effectively something you can give to the sheep. I forget if it's oral or injected. And the wool, when it gets to the relevant maturity, like falls off. And so then you've got a totally different challenge, which is like, how do you go pick up the wool? Like, obviously you don't want it out in a field somewhere and that's get dirty. So are they coming in? Like, can you, like, how much do you control that? But it made me think of that because it's sort of, what problem are you trying to solve? Are we solving the problem of like getting the wool off the sheep fast enough and so we build a machine? Or are we solving like, let's reimagine how this system works and think of the workers and the natural systems and the new technologies we have, and maybe we come up with kind of completely different solutions.
Yeah, I think
and so we're definitely seeing that.
Such a good point. I think people really get stuck on reproducing what's being done now instead of saying, well, maybe there's another way to think of this. And then it becomes quite easy after that.
Exactly. And that's kind of why automation to me is much like if we only think of automation as like make a machine do what the human does, then we're missing the opportunity of automation to redesign the system. And so maybe the automation in the sheep case is like a net that goes out and like collects the wool, right? Like that's much easier automation to build than anything we were talking about before that. So yeah, I think that's really cool to hear those examples in Japan as well.
Yes, anyway, shearing sheep is very challenging. I've watched some people try that.
And if you want to like go down a real like rabbit hole, the social media videos of shearers on this, it is one of the most impressive things I've ever seen. The speed and grace, and it literally looks like an athlete performing this like super athletic task of yeah, and it's very cool.
I'm going to jump in. I'd love to hear a little bit about the podcast part as well. What inspired you to start the podcast and why ag tech? So why the title ag tech? So what? And then I guess the third part of this, how does it connect with your investing in companies as well? Or does it connect? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, started the podcast because I like listening to podcasts and I am an introvert and I would go to these conferences and there'd be these amazing speakers or these farmers and I was like too shy to go up and just do small talk. And so my kind of thought was, well, going up to someone and saying, "Hey, I have a podcast. I heard your story. These things were interesting. Would you like to come on the podcast?" was sort of this easy way in. And then I had an opportunity to talk to and learn from all these amazing people in the sector. And so that plus the idea of there's just so much content now, and I think audio is sort of underutilized. And if you think of a farming context, you may be out harvesting or on the tractor, and so it's a bit easier to like listen to something while you're doing those jobs. And so the combination of those things and that I personally liked it led us to start the podcast. We've actually done over 200 episodes now, so I should update the bio. But it's been awesome. We have like people all over the world. It's such a unique opportunity to get to spend an hour with someone and just ask them whatever you want and like get to understand their story and learn tons. We It's been strategic in ways that I couldn't have possibly imagined. Everything from like people, I've literally had investors fill out the form on our website and end up investing like millions of dollars with us because they like found us online through the content we do. So that loop really does work. Same with startup companies and investors. But I think it's also like um, you can do a bunch of things to buy attention. Like you can have a PR company and be in the media and speak of it, but like reputation is really what matters. And the slightly longer format, putting one out every other week for years, like it's really built our reputation in this space for like how we think, how we do what we do, what are our views. And that's been really invaluable because over time it's meant that people can say, "Hey, I've like kind of listened to and followed you for a while and like I've been thinking about, starting a company or making an investment and this has really resonated and I sort of have that like more trust." And so that's been just so cool to see because you just can't really do that at scale any other way than content. And so we're really proud of that.
Very cool. And it is a very neat podcast. So if those of you who haven't heard it yet, please check it out. And
yes. Oh, and the so what? I didn't answer that. Like, I mean, it's as it is like the technology is sort of interesting, but like doesn't really matter in itself. If there's no one using it, no one benefiting from it, no one able to do something from their couch as a single mom, like it doesn't matter. And so it's sort of like what's the so what here? And yeah. But my recommendation is definitely don't put an ellipses and a question mark in the title because it will wreak havoc on any technical that you want to do in terms of your URLs and your promotion. So that is the downside of that name. And like, is it capitalized? Is it ag tech with a capital T? So pick something more simple is my advice on that front.
all right. Well, we're winding down with the time. Are there any other questions out there? There's been some really good ones. So if not, I would ask Sarah if you have any closing thoughts, especially since we have students here who are exploring opportunities in the careers in ag tech. Do you have any, what would your advice be?
Yeah. So I guess building on that podcast one, content is such a valuable tool. It's been truly like transformative in my career when I didn't know anything about agriculture and food and was really just starting in this space. I would do things like go to a conference. In fact, I couldn't pay for some of the conferences that I wanted to go to. And so I might call the conference organizer and say, "Hey, do you need someone to like take name tags and write you a blog post after about some of the insights or, write up a press release to put out?" And like, there's always like they always need that kind of thing. And so then I'd get in the room and then I'd listen to the content. And because I was, working for the conference, I could ask the speakers, "Hey, I'm writing up a press release. Or I'm writing insights for the conference." And they would talk to me. And then I would write up like 3 takeaways or 5 takeaways from this conference and then put it out and then kind of steal their audience because it would go out through their channel, but with my name on it. And then I could repost it on my LinkedIn. And so decently simple playbook, but had a lot of like standing on the shoulders of giants and like pretty low cost. And so just as a simple example of something that you can do, and it's really scary to like hit publish when it's those insights and did you get the takeaways right or those kinds of things. But it's also the internet and the internet just like will forget it or lose it or whatever. And it's such a useful tool to like force you to think, what did I really learn from this conference? What was this takeaway? And you might get it wrong, but you might get it right. And it starts a conversation with more people. So I just couldn't really recommend that highly enough. And I always offer when I give talks like this, if any of you are like up to the point of hitting publish and nervous to actually hit it, like send it to me and I'll read it and give you confidence to hit publish or do an editing pass, because I had lots of people offer to do that for me. So if you ever want to send me a draft, I'm happy to have a look at it. But that's been such a massive one.
Wow, that's very valuable, actually, in all ways. What I'm hearing is content is extremely valuable. And actually, Sarah, you shared a wonderful tip I hadn't thought of myself with regards to the conference. So I hope everybody takes a crack at that at some point. Well, I want to
Absolutely.
thank you so much for joining us from Australia. That's a real treat, for sharing your journey, your story, and your insights on kind of what's happening in the ag tech space. So if there's no other questions, we're going to close right now. All right. We'll say have a nice day. Have a nice Friday. Thank you.
Absolutely. Happy Halloween, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Amy.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thanks for the questions. Bye, guys.